the same superhero ID. Not so easy to go along with, especially in the case of Alan Scott. I mean, yes, he was Green Lantern, and so was Hal Jordan, but so too were close to 3,600 other characters in the DC universe who went by the title Green Lantern. The only situation which I can see DC needing in 1986 to put a Golden Age character on the shelf in order to help the development of modern day version of the characters in The Flash. And again, I want to put the focus back on Alan Scott. So I'll just say, if you want to know about what was going on during Wally West's early days as The Flash, please go on over to Chris Ivy's Mythmaking ETC and From Kid to Flash podcasts. He's talking about Wally's early days as The Flash right now, and he's doing a great job of it. I must say, I love Chris's podcasts. But to add on to that, there was a lot going on with Wally West post-crisis. He was undergoing a pretty radical character transformation, and I'm thinking in his case, it was important that he be the only hero with the name The Flash, in order to make sure the focus was squarely on his character development, to ensure there won't be any fans getting impatient and saying, okay, this is enough, give us a real Flash, give us Jay Garrick. Wally West, in the first few years of the post-crisis era, had a rough go of it, but after that, he proved himself to be a real Flash. And then when he really became the Flash in mind, body, and soul, that's when it was time to bring Jay Garrick back. But as for the other JSAers, this was a very tough pill to swallow, seeing these characters who have been around for close to 50 years being consigned to limbo. And that's how it would stay for Alan Scott for the better part of 5 years. And it wasn't until issue 19 in volume 3 of Green Lantern that fans would see Alan Scott again. And this was an important anniversary issue. This issue celebrated the 50th anniversary of the creation of the concept of Green Lantern, and more specifically of Alan Scott, by Martin Odell and Bill Finger. It's got a great cover by Silver Age Green Lantern artist, as well as Hal Jordan's co-creator Gil Kane. And on that cover, we see Alan Scott looming large in the background, and in the foreground, near the bottom of the cover, we see Hal Jordan, John Stewart, and Guy Gardner walking towards the reader. And it looks like they're on a quest. They're looking for something or for someone. And as it turns out in this story, they are looking for someone. They're looking for Alan Scott. Now, at this point in the story, all three men were not together. They were at different points. Hal was out in space recruiting members for a new Green Lantern Corps. John Stewart was busy on the Mosaic world. And Guy Gardner was on Earth being an A1 jerk as the resident Green Lantern on the Justice League. But all three men would be visited by a rather spectral visage of Alan Scott, who beseeched all three men to seek him out, to find him. And so for Hal, this was quite interesting because he was making his way through space, and he made a side trip on the planet Murg, where he ran into Alan Scott's wartime buddy, Doiby Dickles. And it turns out that Doiby was alive and well and quite in love. He was actually married to the Queen Ramia of Murg, and there was actually a Silver Age story in which Queen Ramia was first introduced, and Doiby had come to her aid in that story. And now we saw in this story that after World War II, probably sometime in the 1950s, Doiby had been transported to Planet Merg where he could marry his beloved and he became a benevolent king. And clearly he brought some Brooklyn influence with him, as part of the planet actually resembled city of Brooklyn, and the people of Merg loved him. They found him to be this very wise, sage man, and they especially loved the fact that he brought his knowledge of the game of baseball to Merg. And it was actually at a baseball game being played at the local stadium where Hal, Doiby, and Remia were all visited by that ghostly visage of Alan Scott, who reminded Hal to seek him out. And so Doiby took his leave of his queen and his people. He wanted to go back to Earth with Hal to help find Alan, to which Hal agreed, and for good measure, Hal brought not only Doiby back to Earth, but he brought Doiby back in his old jalopy of a cab, Goitrude. So on Earth, Hal, Doiby, John, and Guy all met and went to the home of Alan Scott and his wife Molly Main. And Molly, of course, was quite despondent, having no idea what had happened to her husband some time ago. Well, everyone in the Main Scott household were now visited by that spectral appearance of Alan Scott, who explained that he was not really Alan. Rather, he was a small piece of Alan's soul that had been imbued within Alan's power battery. And when they looked at the power battery, they saw that the lantern was glowing. And this was the source of the spectral vision of Alan. And Alan explained that he wanted to tell the lanterns of his or its origin. And so Hal and company went along with this, and they were transported seemingly back in time by the lantern to feudal China. And it was here that Alan's power battery took on the physical form of Alan Scott in his costume. But this version of Alan, as well as the lanterns, it was kind of like a Christmas Carol, where now they were the ghosts and nobody could see or hear them. And so Hal and company learned that in feudal China there was a visitation by the Green Lantern of Space Sector 2814. And this lantern's name was Galen Gur. And he didn't wear a standard Green Lantern Corps uniform. One might suppose that the Guardians had not gotten around to this just yet. But the costume was primarily green. It had a shirt and pants motif to it. There was a belt with a belt buckle. Galen Gur's boots looked exactly like the boots worn by Alan Scott. Gur also had a purple cape. And Gur was actually quite fascinated by the people of feudal China. And he decided to stay and become an observer and a protector for this new world. And the Guardians, feeling that Gur was, at that time, their greatest lantern, decided that since he was taking the time to explore this backwater primitive world, he should not be constrained by the old impurity in his ring. So the Guardians took it away. Of course, this is many years before Geoff Johns' rebirth. So this effectively left Gur invincible. And like other lanterns after him, primarily Sinestro, Gur would fall prey to his own ego, and he would become a despot. He would even spark conflicts on Earth so that he could quell them and thus further establish his dominance over the planet. And this drew the ire of the Guardians, who decided that they needed to give the people of Earth a way to fight back against Gur. And they did that by giving Gur's ring and lantern a new weakness, that which was made of wood. And so the people of Earth were able to take up bats, spears, clubs, anything made of wood, and beat Gur into submission. He tried escaping by flying off planet, but he was so distracted and so beaten that he did not erect a force field around him. And so he found himself falling back into Earth's atmosphere. And as he did, his body burned up and he died. Not only that, but his lantern also burned up to the point where it took on the shape and texture of a glowing green meteor. Not only that, Gur's soul, which would not be allowed to have any rest until atoning for Gur's earlier actions, now merged with his lantern, which crashed to Earth in the form of a glowing green meteor, which would be reshaped by an elderly man in China. That lamp would pass hands many times until it reached the hands of a patient in an asylum, who would reshape the lamp into a lantern, which eventually came into the possession of a young railroad engineer named Alan Scott. What was really interesting and enjoyable about this story was that it was penciled by Martin Nodell. So, from a purely visual standpoint, it was a great lead-in to All-American Comics number 16. I've got to say, for the time, Nodell still had it as an artist. His art had a more cartoony look compared to other artists in the early 90s, but still, it was a lot better than some of the art produced by artists of the time. The only problem with the story, though, is that it really supplanted the Daniel O'Neil Starheart origin story, which had been confirmed in the pages of Secret Origins number 18. And this was just one of many examples of stories being written in the post-crisis era that directly contradicted stories which had been told even earlier in the post-crisis era. There was no mention of the Starheart here, because Gur's lantern was created by the Guardians and was based on Owen's size. There's no longer any real explanation as to why Alan's power battery had mystical properties to it. One could surmise that it was because it was Gur's spirit that was inside the lantern, and maybe Gur's spirit gave the newly reshaped lantern a different set of characteristics that one would mistake for mystical properties. It also suggested that Yael Gur was responsible for influencing the design of Alan's costume, something which I will talk about in part 2 of this episode, why I really didn't care for this suggestion. But looking at the time that is remaining, I have just enough time to tell you that part 2 of episode 103 will come your way in 7 days. Until then, consider this class in recess.